This morning, I want to make some more observations about how the Rome Research Reading Group on Sönke Ahrens' book, How to Take Smart Notes, is going. And also, I have some thoughts of my own about the first chapter, basically the notes that I've taken about that. So to begin with, the reading group is going very well. It seems that a lot of people are beginning to put their notes up. One thing that I have noticed is that a lot of people seem to be block quoting long passages of Ahrens' text. I'm seeing that the text has not only been reproduced for readers who don't have their own digital Kindle versions of the book, but also people are copying big chunks into their own pages and then highlighting those passages and then commenting on them. I'm very interested in their comments and their observations and also on the things that they chose to highlight. But I'm not sure that I really see overall the point of block quoting for two reasons. First, the way that I think Ahrens describes Luhmann's Zettelkasten workflow, it doesn't sound like this is exactly the way that Luhmann used his slipboxes. I haven't read the source texts yet, but the sense that I get from this is that he had a separate box for bibliographic references with short descriptions from the texts that he was choosing. And then he had his sort of permanent notes box where he was actually working with his own interpretations and ideas based on the things that he had picked up in those sources. I think it's fair to say that any source is going to have a lot more in it than I, as a reader, am going to take out of it at any given time that I read it. This is because even if I try to be a blank slate, and I'm not even 100% sure that in most cases that's the reading state that I should be going for, even so, when I'm reading, I usually have a question in my mind, or at least a thought in my mind. So I'm finding information or I'm drawn to ideas and arguments in the text that relate to that interest that I already have. That's why all the people who highlight and comment these different sections of the text in the social graph are going to have slightly different things to say. And that's why I'm interested in those different things that they key in on. So this should be interesting, but it's also why I sometimes get different things out of a source when I go back to it. I don't 100% agree with Luhmann's idea that he never goes back to a text, especially if my understanding of a topic has changed or evolved in the intervening time. I've had this experience quite a bit recently as I've been reviewing the notes that I made very early in my history grad school career, or even earlier before I became a historian. I should mention that I'm not that interested in what Luhmann said about the slipbox because I care deeply about getting it right or about emulating the master. I want to see the workflow that was effective for him, though, and then consider whether it would work for me or in what ways I could modify it. I'm not going to get involved in arguments about what Luhmann actually meant or whether people are following his teachings correctly. I don't think there's any point in that. But my second reason for questioning the efficacy of these big block quotes in Rome is that I'm not really convinced that Rome Research is the ideal tool to be storing the media that I'm processing. So far, and I have to keep repeating that so far for me means less than a month of actually using Rome at this point. It seems to me that Rome is brilliant at manipulating hypertext. I haven't reached a critical mass, I don't think, in my graph yet, and I haven't settled on a routine for regularly reviewing and integrating my notes and connecting the ideas, but it seems to me like the bi-directional links are going to be very helpful with that, and I can see this working. And I suspect that the block quotes that are built into Rome itself will be very valuable in this linking process, although I'm not that familiar with them or how to use them yet. But I don't think that the internal block quoting process that I'm hearing about in Rome is analogous to grabbing huge chunks from outside texts and bringing them into Rome. As I understand Rome's block quotes, they're a way of referring to other sections of my graph without the need to cut and paste them and duplicate text. Sort of a Ted Nelson-esque idea where there's only one instance of anything out there and then everything else is a link to it. This is, of course, much less necessary today when We have tons and tons of storage available to us, but it still seems to be a more elegant and a more logical way to go. I like having, and I value having, permanent access to the sources that I quote because I don't really trust the web to preserve them, which is why I've been downloading PDFs of articles and appending them to my EndNote or my Zotero bibliographies for years now, even before I started using Evernote or MarginNote 3 as a notes app. But I don't want to have many copies. I want to have one. Which brings me back to the question of where to store that one. And at this moment, it doesn't seem to me like Rome is the ideal place, especially since an increasing percentage of the content that I'm processing is actually in other forms of media rather than just in print. In this new environment, a very text-focused tool like Rome, I think, is better for writing than for curating all of the content that I want to process. Why not use a variety of tools that are each tuned to be best at these different tasks? So those are my musings as I'm going through this process. Now I'll say something about the first chapter of the book, How to Take Smart Notes. The things that jumped out at me. Luhmann apparently said that he never forced himself to do anything that he didn't like, but he was nevertheless extremely productive. Ahrens later in the book says that Luhmann worked on a number of projects simultaneously and jumped back and forth between them as the spirit moved him. Ahrens talks about breaking down the process of writing a paper into small tasks that can be repeated regularly and successfully. I kind of had a similar thought when I was writing my dissertation at first. An average page, I realized, was about 2 paragraphs. That means that an average 300-page book has only about 600 or so paragraphs in it. And a paragraph is relatively easy to write. Do 5 a day, and I can complete a couple of books a year. Ahrens also says that a good student or an author who's interested in a variety of topics needs a system to keep track of them, of what he calls an ever-increasing pool of information, and to allow the researcher to question these ideas, to compare them, and to combine them in ways that generate new insights. These ideas are not necessarily just data points. Usually they're interpretations or the beginnings of theories. Ahrens claims that the simplicity of the slipbox structure allows for it to get out of the way of the content of the notes. It's designed to be the simplest possible way to store these atomized points and to retrieve them and to mix them together and combine them and compare them and work with them. I wonder if there are limitations to this. Are there ideas that are just too complex to break down in this way, that don't lend themselves to this type of summary? I'm not saying that there are. I'm raising the question, though. It's a possibility. Ahrens also says Luhmann had 2 boxes, as I've mentioned. One for bibliographical information and summary notes, and then one for his own ideas, elaborating on those data points. He tended to write new permanent notes with his existing notes in mind. The point was to find at least one point of connection between the new idea that he was bringing in and the existing ideas already in the box. This was not necessarily the ultimate and the most important connection because the box was going to evolve and the notes in it. But it was a starting point that anchored this new idea into this constellation of knowledge that he was already working with. A truly random piece of data probably has very little hope of being remembered or ever revisited. Whenever Luhmann added a new idea, he considered its context in terms of the ideas that he was already interested in. This is the main point here. This was physically manifested in his numbering system. But again, the initial position and number seems to have been only a first step that was always subject to modification. And this, of course, argues against the idea that other note systems use of excessive keywording or tagging or choosing folders as we do in the other systems. So those were some of the things that jumped out at me about the first chapter. I'll be very interested to see what other people focused on and what excited them. So I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next time.